Okay. Hello, everyone. How's it going? Sorry it took a while. Apparently, today, YouTube and Riverside are not the best friend. It took exactly 1 minute and 50 seconds for the one to catch up with the other, I think. Yes. But we should be live, right? Hello, everyone. Let's see who we have in chat here. As always, we have Ratius, hello, welcome back. Then we have Monman, excited to join live for the first time. Well, welcome. We have Spirits as always. Good day to you as well. And Steven, what's up? Effect Enjoyers as well. Hello. Hello, everyone. So, how's been your week? Again, as always, did everyone break something? Because if you didn't break anything, you didn't do anything, I would say. As always, breaking production is a good metric. So, I don't have a plan for today, as always. So I would say that the plan is not having a plan. But I've seen that you all have been more and more organized than me, and you already have sent some questions over the office hours channel. So let's see. It was too hot to break anything. That's true. I can relate to that. Definitely. I don't know about where you are, but in here is about 30 degrees with about like 65% humidity. So yeah, that that hits quite a while. Let me also close entirely the window because apparently it started to raining. So I don't want any sound to come in. So let's see what we have to deal with today. So we had one question from Eastballs. I don't know if we can maybe show the question. It's 30 degrees inside of my room. Wow. Well, yeah, it's not that different in here, but yeah. So we have a question that's kind of long. So maybe let's find first a way to show just the question. Maybe we can do like this. Let me just do a little bit of window management real quick. Paste. And yes, appearance, zooming. Yes, okay. Let me share my screen. Share. No. Okay, so let me increase the size. Okay. So it is quite a long question. Probably it goes through some implementation details, but I think that is touching some interesting topics, I would say. As always, take my idea on that as something I recommend, not as the truth. But let's dive into the question. So the question comes from Eastballs. And the question is, not sure if this should go here or there are good effect solution for resumable/durable streams for agents. The ideal case I describe as Each agent step, generation, tool call, etc., is adorable and checkpointed as soon as it finishes. The client receives a live stream of every chunk, result, etc. For checkpointed steps, the stream has durable semantics. And for the current step ephemeral may be lost or replayed. Let me also zoom in a real more. Okay. On client disconnect, it can resume from its last consumed chunk. On server crash, on restart, automatically pick up where it left off. Interrupted step gets retried. LLM streams are restarted. Tool calls may have inner checkpointing, but may involve walking back the stream, a new LLM request, replay tool, etc. Stream is able to include these, so the client can automatically discard overridden ephemeral state. Basically, the whole package for durability around agents. I'm admittedly not very familiar with cluster or workflows. From what I've seen, looking at the repo, it seems that some of the blocks are there, but workflows don't really support streams result in step for good reasons, obviously. I'm trying to model the stream as a cluster entity, so also doesn't seem like a great solution as it involves a database write on every chunk, which doesn't seem like reasonable approach. Okay, so I think that this opens for quite a few things and quite a few APIs that may be interesting to look into. I admit that I have implemented something similar in the past, not with streams, but with basically resumable LLM agents. So I could maybe work through what would be my approach in breaking up this problem. And as you mentioned, you got the feeling that cluster and workflows already provide some of the probably the building units that you would use in order to build such an abstraction. And I definitely agree with that because let's basically try to split this problem. So, as you have stated, basically an agent has steps, and the steps can be generation, they can be tool call, or something else, right? And basically, what we are describing is basically a durable conversation with the agent, right? Something that can be like only one turn. The agent start, do some jobs, and then call tools, whatever, and then comes back, or maybe it can be even like multi-turn. So I think that this opens for basically splitting the problem in many steps. We need first, I think, to define the single resumable and activities that are involved in this problem. You pointed out that we have generation and we have indeed tool calls, and I think that those ones are probably the most important ones that we will encounter. But the thing is that we need to be kind of like careful about how they are implemented because for tool calls, it may happen that the tool call may fail or the server may crash while performing a tool call. So in order to have this durable agent, what we can do is we can do a durable agent only if all of its tools can be basically durable and uh, basically can be resumed or idempotent. Basically, whenever we have some tool calls that may crash uh, in the middle, we need to have a way for that tool call to be reperformed and be sure that it doesn't get executed twice, it doesn't get left in a half-baked state. And this is more like, I think, a problem of what are the tools that you provide to the agent. And the other part is the generation or the LLM generation, which I think if you look, if we maybe open the GitHub for effect, we'll see that the generation step, as always, let me increase the font size. Is that good enough? So one thing is the tool execution, and the other one is the agent execution. So regarding the agent execution, I think, if I recall correctly, if we go into unstable AI, we have a data structure that's called prompt. And the prompt is basically the order list of messages that your agent gets. And the thing is that you can start your agent execution either from just an initial prompt, or you can record and persist somewhere basically the last checkpoint for the entire conversation as an AI prompt. And then what you can do is that the language model has a generate text API that takes in the prompt from which we want to start, and then it starts generating the response out of that prompt. Maybe we can show here. Here we have example, yes. We pass in the prompt, as I mentioned, and the prompt can be even just a single message, or it can be like, oh, sorry, wrong window, as always. Let me share again the screen. Window, yes. There we go. Yeah, sorry. So I was saying, I was saying that we have basically the abstraction built in the effect AI model, because what's called prompt is actually more like the previous chat history from what you want to resume from. And then from there, you basically continue your conversation. So basically, we could say that you can give an initial message, and then you can generate some text, and then you get back a response. And this response is basically the chat history that gets updated. And then that history that's now updated, you need to persist and replace the old prompt that you had initially and continue from there. So you can imagine that this simple loop can be durable, in fact, because you can consider each generation step as something that is, for example, an effect workflow activity, and then you just have activities that may generate a portion of the text. They may be even able to stream it, but what you persist is basically the entire chunk of step of the generation of the text. And then what you get back is basically the response that the LLM gave. And the response may contain like conversation pieces, like the reply that the LLM gives, but the response may also contain elements such as invoking a tool. And the interesting part is that Effect AI as a disabled tool call resolution parameter that can be provided. And when we provide the disabled tool call resolution parameter to true, what happens is that that call to generate text won't execute the tools. It will just return in the response the actual structure that contains the tools that needs to be invoked. So what you can imagine that you can do is you can create an effect workflow where you can basically loop, starting from the initial message, you generate the initial chunk of the LLM text, and then what you do, you grab back the response, with the disabled tool call resolution set to true, you then extract by using the prompt module. You can extract the tool calls to execute from the response. You can do the execution yourself, and then you can do the execution of those tools as basically activities, and then you fed back the result of those tools back into the AI prompt history. And then you can just basically loop into the forever in order to achieve that. And the question got one correct point, I think, is that you can do this basically both with a cluster workflow or with a cluster entity. Because if you think about it, we can either have like a conversation entity, or we could have like a conversation workflow. Both works. They have, in my opinion, like different capabilities, because as you mentioned, if it is modeled like a workflow, it is easier to write because it's basically a while through loop that performs the single step, but it has the downside that it cannot stream things as they happen, because a workflow is a workflow. It has an execution, it starts. If you want to stream something, you would have to add like a side stream that gets fed as the workflow gets executed. Or the other approach could be building it as a cluster entity. And building it as a cluster entity would allow you, for example, to have the same approach of basically persisting each step yourself, and then you loop into the execution. But what you can do with an entity is that you can feed like a pub sub with events as things happen. So you can have on the same cluster entity methods that provide a subscription to set pub sub, and those will stream back the results as the execution of the entity works, while still having that durable feel, because again, with the cluster entities, you can decide when to acknowledge messages. So when to decide that the entity basically has finished is processing, and you can use entity.keepAlive true or false to basically pilot if you want the entity to shut down or be kept alive. And the only thing is obviously that you would have to manage yourself the persistence of the chat history. That is not difficult, but then again, it depends on what is the thing you would use this durable entity for. I would also say that depending on your AI provider, if you are maybe not using Effect AI module, you can also like probably get something better, because if your AI provider provides resumable streams, because I've seen that some provider are starting to do that, you can take advantage of that and then have just an entity that delegates that. You can also have a mixture of both, because you may have like a cluster entity that does the orchestration, but then you can execute your tools as workflows. So you can like trigger the execution of workflows and then wait back for the result to come. So I think that there is quite a few of opportunity in here that can be explored. I think that they are mostly all valid solution. It really depends on what are you using your durable agent for. If you plan, for example, for a durable agent that doesn't have a long history, and maybe it's not too much interactive, going for the workflow only solution works. Because again, the problem with the workflow solution is that every time we spun up again the workflow, we basically replay the activities. And that means that if the chat becomes very, very, very long, that means that you will need to replay the entire history. But usually, I think with the LLM use case, that's not the case, because again, giving the LLM a huge like conversation as a context, usually it's not good. But yeah, I hope that this covers some of the ideas on how these could be implemented. And I did indeed the feeling that the building blocks are already there is real. I think it's not just there as a standard solution because again, there are not yet full standard that describes. Um, at least as far as I know, other people in the team may be more aware of that. But as I know, there is no standard solution on how you should describe a durable AI chat in that meaning, protocol wise. I would mean. Okay, so let's see if we have other questions. Hoping that I have like given like overall about that. So let's see. Yes. Okay. So let me check back what we have in the channel. Office hours. Yes, here we are. I think that if we oh, okay. Oh, it's Bolznier. Thank you so much for taking time to look at this. It's given me a lot to think about. Back to the lab now. Yes, I'm glad that that gave you an overall of what you can investigate. Again, the implementation probably it's harder than what it looks like. But as you pointed out, I think that all of the building blocks are already there in effect packages. You just need to assemble them to your pleasure and also according to your use case. So thank you again for your question. It was a quite interesting one to dive into. Okay, so let me check. I think we didn't had other questions on the Discord. There was one I replied AFK. Regarding some dev tooling for fact that if we don't have any other question, I would like to still show on the screen and go through because it was an interesting report to look into. Let me see. Okay, so there was this question. Let me share maybe on the screen in here. Revisions. Okay. Okay, so we had this question on the office hours channel that was basically a report that an AI agent gave while basically having a look at the statistics of the conversation transcripts, and that pointed out to some configuration that are interesting for how to set up your environment for the effect tooling regarding mainly the effect LSP. So basically, going through the request, it says that the effect languages service give some advisory diagnostics, for example, floating effects, etc., that are fine for editor usage, but for an agent, these advisories arrive as flat text interleaved with other errors, and so they basically collide with compiler errors. And also, it mentioned that there is no severity field to gate on, so the agent only recourse is run TSC and then run filtering for error TS and watch the error that happens. Basically, there are some like script of transcripts of what the agent said. For example, those are not compiler type error. Let me confirm that there are 0 actual TypeScript error by checking the exit code and filtering for real error TS line or other advisories that the effect LSP does. And so the question asked was asking for a mode that emits structure metadata for the effect LSP diagnostics so that the agent can gate on severity instead of regexping the TS codes. There was also a request for a diagnostic namespace, like a prefix with LSP diagnostic effect rule instead of TS number, in order to prove that those entries are not types checker entries, but they are LSP entries. And also, finally, an exit code contract that advisory only runs should not change the exit status, only real error should. Because today agent confirmed that a clean run is done by rechecking the exit code. And I basically gave a reply about this. I would still go into the reply is that regarding the machine readable severity in headless output, if you are using the effect language service, there is already a CLI in here that you can run. You can run effect language service diagnostics, and these will basically get you out the list of effect specific diagnostics for your project or for a specific file. And you can even configure them on the fly via the CLI. And this command has also the ability to output the diagnostics in a format that can be structured. For example, if I recall correctly, there is JSON, there is plain text, and there is also like a CI, a GitHub CI compatible format, so that you can, for example, run this command as part of your CI. And this will give structured output for the the errors you get. And there's replies to the asking for the agent to have some structured output. And the second one is a diagnostic namespace. And regarding that, all of the effect diagnostic already have an ending effect and parentheses and the name of the rule. And the synthesized TS number, unfortunately, is kind of a limitation of how we are leveraging the type checker compiler. But starting from the effect TSGo, all of the effect related diagnostic gets their own number range. It is 377 followed by whatever. And that allows you basically to tell the agent, hey, those are effect diagnostics. So you know that they are diagnostics. And finally, there is the exit code contract, because advisory only run should not change the exit status. So regarding this, there is a setting in the language service. If we go back to the list of settings, there is ignore exit. There is 3 different settings. Ignore effect warnings in TSC exit code, ignore effect errors in TSC exit code, or ignore effect suggestion in TSC exit code. And with these, you can basically decide whatever if you want to gate your exit code of TSC based on the warnings, error, or suggestions that have been emitted by the effect diagnostics. That means that, for example, you can make it so the agent compiles and let the checks pass, even though some effect diagnostics that emits a warning are still passed. Or you can do the opposite and make it so the code does not compile if the diagnostics do not pass. And I have seen people enabling them, for example, in code bases and making them strict, obviously optimize, because that way, when your agent does a coding job and then reaches the end, when it does the type checking at the end, it gets like a stronger signal that this diagnostic, the lintic, has not passed. And that's kind of why also we include the effect LSP diagnostics inside of the TSC. First, because we use a lot of type checking, and doing that externally would mean type checking again the source files. And the second one is also that we get that nice DX that for the agent, that the agent really love to run directly TSC or TSGo. And with that, we make sure that even if the agent maybe avoids your build script or build command and goes directly for TSC, it will still emit the effect diagnostics. And hope that this gives you also a few hints on how you can fine tune how you want your effect diagnostics to behave for your project. Let's also check in the chat if we have other question. Does anybody know if there are plans to write a book about effect? And yeah, we already had a direct response. Yes, James Ward is working on it. So there will be a book about effect. Yes. Okay, so let's see if we have other questions in the chat or in the Discord channel. Let's see. I think that we do not have nothing in here. Let's see. This we had replied to. Okay. So there was a question last time that has come from Olange, I think. Yes. I'll try to go to the question and maybe we'll see if I have enough context to reply to the question. Unfortunately, it may be that I do not have enough context to do so, but let's anyway go through the question we had last time. I'll keep that open in here. Okay. So if you are live, Alliance, please feel free to add any metadata to the question that you did before, any more context. So the question basically was any primitive on manage runtime, runtime layer, and scope to derive a child runtime, inheriting the parent scope plus memomap plus tracing span. If so, I delete my wrapper. Is anyone in the community core chasing similar goals per sub-tree runtimes or runtime composition for component frameworks? If not, is this pattern worth publishing for scrutiny, or is the reason it's not in the core that I'm missing something? Example, a foot gun sharing one scope / memo map across many derived runtimes. So I would say initially that probably this feels more like an XY problem. You're making a question about potential implementation for a solution. I would be interested as well in what is the overall problem you are attempting to tackle. But regarding the primitives on manage runtime, runtime layer, and scope to derive a child runtime inheriting the parent scope plus memo map plus tracing span. Okay, so let's go over this. So if I recall correctly, if we go inside of the effect repository, oops, not there. If we go in here and if we search, for example, for fiber set, okay. So one thing that comes to mind to me is a fiber set, because a fiber set is something that give you a collection of fibers that can be managed together, and basically you create the fiber set instead of a scope. That's part of what you were describing, basically inheriting this parent scope, and that's part of that. And it closes the runtime when the parent scope is closed, and all the fibers inside of that will basically share the same. And also, if I recall correctly, the fiber set can also be made so that it can share the context. Make runtime. There you go. It can basically share the runtime that is coming from the caller. The thing that I would be aware of, based on the description again you gave, it may not be correct, but that will basically share all of the context. So that means that it will share basically all of the services and the memo map and etc. that comes from that. But I am not sure, and this is more an open question to what you are trying to achieve. If you are instead looking for something where you just control the lifetime and the parent spawn, and then you may have some services that are locally fresh. And if that's so, I think that you would need like a mixture of something like a fiber set, um, plus maybe refreshing some layers, or maybe passing in a build context that only has the span parent span tag in the context, and the parent scope controls, as we said, how much basically the lifetime when the fiber set should be shut down. Um, because you describe this as a wrapper, and I am not sure what's the usage of your wrapper. Unfortunately, without knowing that, it's not easy to fully reply to the question. But I hope that these should give you like more hints on how you could achieve that. Again, fiber set make runtime um, sounds like something that um, is interesting to me. And yeah, can do carriage return on YouTube comments. Yeah, unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, that's one limitation of YouTube. Yeah, you can do multi-line comments if I recall correctly. I may recall wrong. I think you can paste in them, but I'm not sure if you can. But otherwise, if you are in the process of writing maybe a long question, what I would suggest you is to join our Effect Discord. We can go to effect.website. There we go. And you can click the Discord button, join the Effect Discord, and then we have an office hours channel in here where you can post your question. So, and also that comes in handy if you, in the future you have additional question, you can post them, whatever. Basically, my app runtime instance is a mess. Okay, so do you have maybe some gist you can share, or if it's public, a repo or something, where you we can take a look? You can even just paste in few snippets like where you declare it, where you use it, so we can look together on how that could be improved. Another suggestion that I always point to, because I think that's um, a very good resource for that. Um, Last year's Effect Days had one intervention. It was a workshop, if I recall correctly. Let me grab that real quick. But I recall that there was on the Effect Days 25. Yes, there is. Worship. Sorry, let me. There it is. There is this video. There is this video from Tim that described at some point. Anyway, described at some point some patterns on how to integrate effect runtime with existing, and it goes into what we have described of fiber handle, fiber set, fiber map, and also there is also, if I recall correctly, the runtime as well. But this is like very, very, very interesting because it gives you some examples and also some gotchas in how to integrate that. Meanwhile, we got another question saying, if someone is totally new to Effect, as I am currently, and I am really interested in learning Effect, do you recommend the courses on Effect that are provided by Lucas Barak? I have not followed the course from Lucas Barak, so I cannot like give feedback on the exact course. But on the feedback I have on the usual videos that Lucas posts on the YouTube, I would say yes. I definitely recommend that. And also, as always, Given Effect has a pretty substantial like um, API surface, and also like overall of what you need to understand and what you need to learn to. If you have access to a coding agent, what I always recommend to um, is to give yourself some pragmatic task and then try to converse with the agent and ask the agent what are the basic minimum primitives you need to know in order to build that feature, or let the agent build that feature by keeping that minimum set of features. And then once either you or the agent have implemented that, go through that and also use the agent to basically explain to you what's happening behind the scene, because I do not believe in learning things all up front and then using them in practice. I think that learning and using some stuff should go like side by side. You should raise your knowledge as you raise your requirements. So you should start with a small requirement, so that means that usually it has a smaller knowledge up front, and then you evolve. You need, when you are learning something new, what I always suggest is pick a vertical slice in your application for which you can use effect for. Try to do that with effect, either manually or using agents, and then either converse with the agent or read only the APIs that are needed in order for that to learn. And also, again, in order to be productive with effect, I think that we have myth. Effect is impossible to learn, and there are so many function and modules. This connects to that. I would say that probably if you get a grasp on how what does those functions do and what does those modules do, and you are basically able to create simple programs with using those functions, I think that you up and running for basically starting to learn effect. Because I can tell you from practice, from what I've done in the past, that I have shipped a real world production application by just using, I think, almost only those APIs. I didn't even use much layers at the time, but yeah, you can get productive with effect even by just knowing few APIs. So I would suggest that you start building a very small feature with that. He recently updated his courses. He has two courses, one called Practical Effect and the other Effect Atom, which I'm thinking about buying. Yeah, I think that Practical Effect probably it's the first one you would dive into, and I would maybe wait a little to look into the second one, unless you want to do Effect on the front end from day one. But yeah, I think that usually the Lucas resources are great. So I think that you should look into it. And Matthias better than Maxwell. Keep this a secret, y'all. No, I would not say that. I would say the opposite, but yeah. And thanks for your info, much appreciated. Well, you're welcome. I am glad that whatever I pointed you at is useful for you. There was another question. If you were to start a new frontend project, which set of library would you choose? For example, Effect, Atom plus React Tanstack or Foldkit? Uh, well, um, I would say that um, first of all, as always, it really depends on uh, what is the purpose of your frontend project. Um, Effect Atom, in my opinion, is a must, a go-to. And then I think that whatever you add on top of that, like React plus Stack, for example, or Folkit, uh, works. Folkit, as we have seen on the stream last time, has a pretty different approach because Effect Atom goes for the atom reactivity pattern, which is more like MobX, for example, whereas Folkit goes more into the Elm architecture with messages, and then that's more like verbose, but that's more like controlled. And I would say that if you probably plan on having something that's evergreen, and also something you are probably using heavy usage of AIs, I wouldn't be interested to get a try to folk it. Again, I have not tried that yet for something that's like um, a good sized application yet. I've tried that for a couple of small apps, but they were like a couple of screens, not something bigger yet. But I could see that working with something bigger, and it is definitely way testable than other approaches, like for example Tanstack or whatever. But yeah, I would say that Effect Atom, if you don't go for Folkit, is a go-to because it really has that nice reactive primitive that I really love. And going back to the previous question, I also recommend using Matpock's Stitch skill inside of Effect Small repository to create your own intro course to Effect. Yes, I think that we went through that last time. But basically, what we usually recommend, I think that it has been posted. Miscellaneous. Yeah, there is this post we shared from our great Maxwell that shared how you can basically clone inside of your project repositories the effect sources, and then you can use basically any skill or just conversate with your agent asking question about, hey, I want to do this, how would I do that in effect, can you do that, and while you do that, can you teach me what I need to know in order to understand what's going on? And that really works. I have tried that a couple of times with parts of other systems, not with Effect, but parts of other libraries I didn't know much about. And yeah, I think that this really, really works. And it is so nice to learn while you conversate with the AI, also how to learn how to do, for example, things like better system architecture or whatever. I've used it to learn how to use DDD plus hexagonal architecture with Effect, and it was a blast. Yeah, that's exactly one good use case for that. I have another question. I have a monorepo with SDK, business logic, and two client-side apps, desktop and mobile, both with React. Currently, Effect is scoped to SDK package and the facade export APIs by converting Effect to promises. Yeah, that sounds good to me. Again, one nice feature of Effect is that you can now expose basically for free both promise-based and effect-based APIs. And so that way your consumer can use either one or the other based on what the consumer wants to do. Um, and I think that that pattern works. It also like helps if your SDK needs to be shipped to third-party users, that so that way they are not feels like obligated to use effect. But if they use effect, they already get for free your typed errors, your services that you may expose via the APIs, your layers, and etc. 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 So yeah, I think that's something that really works. I think that also I think that one example of that is, if I recall correctly, I think that upload thing is using effect. Yeah, update effect dependencies. See, it and it. I think it has APIs that works whatever minimal app there maybe. Yeah. Creator under, yeah, you can see that maybe in basically you can hide the fact behind the scene, but you can have then your packages APIs to upload thing. If I recall correctly, it was in here. You can see effect platform, and then you have the client. Yeah. And then you can see that you can expose basically both the effect APIs and the non-effect APIs. And then it's up to the user to choose basically whatever they want. You can return the HTTP API handler, or you can just wrap it and run it internally without exposing to the user the fact that you are using effect. So yeah, I think that that is indeed one great pattern, and also one pattern that helps even incremental adoption in existing code bases, because you can start rewriting parts of your code bases. Like, for example, let's say that you started with an SDK that was promise based. You can start rewriting your SDK with effect, still exposing the old SDK contracts as promises, and then have parallel APIs that returns the effect. And then eventually you can toggle off and switch from the promise-based SDK APIs to the effect ones when the consumer are ready to consume effects and not the promise anymore. So there was another question. I love your feedback on this question. So the question is how to handle errors reusably and composably. Let's see. Let's see. Maybe let's just copy it, paste it again, so we can increase the font size for you all. Okay. I'm working on a project using HTTP client from Effect platform to create a client service for an internal API. For standardization in the code, we map all errors to a common application error type. I'd like to have some composable utilities for handling that mapping in the error channel that I can pop into the individual request methods. However, I haven't found a solution that feels good. Main issue I came My main issue came up when I was making a service to act as an API client for another part of our stack. I wanted a composable way of mapping all of the error that could arise to the common application error. The best I could came up with some LLM was, so you have a function that's called map error type that takes the error type. It takes a transform that goes from the error E to an application error. And then it returns back a function that, given the effect that has any error that extends the initial error type, it returns a new one with application error excluded the other ones, and you just do a fat catch if the error is the one that is assignable to that, by using error instance of error type, and then we map that to our transformed error. Then I use like a map error. I want the HTTP client error response error to be this new application error. Okay, so this is basically a transformation that takes in the error and then transform that into the other one. So that said, that works well for HTTP client response and parser to parser, but I couldn't find the correct error type exposed for HTTP body error, so those had to be handled with copy paste code in each root method. I love any suggestions on how to handle this. I'm also open to arguments for why this structure is just a bad idea in the first place, as I am still relatively new to Effect. So, okay, so my first my first reaction is that usually I don't like much this mapping. I get why that's done, but usually I don't like much these mapping utilities, uh, unless they become like real complex. If that's really just the implementation of the utility, um, I would avoid that unless it has like more and more complex logic. Uh, but I think that what I would do is probably like leveraging the consumer directly the catch if, and maybe instead of focusing on creating something that catches that does directly basically the catch and the erasure of the type, um, I would probably focus on just building the transformation function, and then we can reuse the catch if providing the transformation function. Probably that's what I would focus to. Also, again, it depends. If you really want to, if your API is basically, if your API basically just discard those error types, also, and this is basically a generic application error, um, I usually don't see much value in a generic application error, um, because the thing is that uh, this feels like something that could go in the defects, if that's something general. Again, if all of your APIs returns an application error, probably that's not something meaningful, I would say, because probably you are just propagating that application error to the boundaries. Probably that could be something that you convert your errors into defects, and then maybe you can just type on the edge the defect as an application error. But yeah, I would say that probably I would need like a bit more of context in order to understand what's happening in here, because generally speaking I could see something like this, basically just catching some kind of errors and mapping them to something else, um, but not to a generic application error. I would map them probably to at least like a vertical slice of your application error, something like that. Because if you just want to maybe provide application errors, for general errors, probably you can get away with having like an HTTP API middleware could do that, or converting any defect into an application error, because you have the code and the code seems to be fixed, the error is just wrapped in, and then request failed. Yeah, I would need please more context about this question, because I have like mixed ideas based on what is the usage for this pattern that you are describing. And but yeah, overall the catch if combinator is really useful for this kind of mapping, because not always you can catch by tag. And if you already, for example, if the errors are schemas, um, instead of doing like this instance of check, I see that we have this tagged error constructor. Um, if this comes from effect schema, instead of doing this check and that you have to manually type, you can also do like something like schema.is error type schema, and this will automatically get you the function that takes basically that one. So yeah, I'm sorry, I would need like a bit more of context to fully understand the question, but yeah. And also, I think that if you research over the forum, I think that it has already been discussed. Yeah, there was quite a few topics on how to write generic error handlers instead of repeating, for example, this. And you can use the match module, or if I recall correctly, you can use, there you go, the catch if. That is basically what you have just done. And you can do, oh yeah, you can use the schemas to define your error. You also get type guard for free. Yeah. Let's see if the playground link still works, just to, yeah, you can see here you have custom errors, you can fail with them, and then you can say catch if schema.is custom error error1, and this should, in theory, see, without any annotation, this automatically infers um, the correct typings, because you get in your effect and you get back an effect that excludes from the errors your custom error1. So yeah, I would say that probably you can clean up that by using schema as well, if you already are using schemas. But yeah, thanks for taking a look at this. This is my question. To add a bit more context, the code field of the application error would be changed to reflect the specific error that occurred. So it's unique per mapping. Okay. I'll also absolutely check out other forum posts. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, if the code is per error type, yeah, I think that if the code is per error type, I think that you can, given you are still embedding the error, I think that you can also define the error itself as the error code itself as a getter, and that could be then automatically be fed by inspecting the inner error. And so that way, what you would do is basically just map the errors to the application error, and the code would get automatically be constructed. But again, that depends if you want like a central place where you map all of the general error types to error codes, or if they needs to be known upfront. Because I could also imagine like one place in your application where you define things like we define errors like class my error extends schema tagged error blah 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 blah, and then maybe you also provide some field that says up error code, and then you set the value, and then you can define your up error as something that says code and return this dot up error code, or if there is not there, it can consume the current error code of the embedded error, where obviously we will have something like error being the schema defect, for example. I could also see something like this working. This centralized where you do the error mapping, still allowing your custom errors to basically be typed, and then only at the edge you map them into the inner error, and you give the code as something that gets computed. But yeah, again, that depends on the use case, but I hope that at least I gave you some hints on how you can tackle the issue. Okay, so let's check if we have other questions on the office hours channel. It does not seem so. Okay, schema.defect is a chef kiss. Yes, it is indeed. It is indeed. Um, it also has got recently improved in effect v4, because while playing around with it, I noticed some edges that can be improved, and thanks to the great Julio, we now have it being improved. Because if you look now at the definition of schema.defect, let me open again. Fact ts fact small. If we go into here, maybe let's go in pull request. I remember that was recently closed. Refactor schema defect and schema error. Should we be using schema optional defect or just plainly schema.defect? Well, it depends. If you have cases where you don't have the inner error, I would use the optional one. If you always want to wrap an error, if that error, like the application error, describes something that always have an inner error that gets wrapped, I would use plain schema.defect. And I also wanted to go through, because this refactor had few additions. Now we have schema.defect and schema.error. Basically, you can specify include stack true to get as well the error stack serialized over the boundaries. So for example, if you have an RPC and you want the client to get the full error stack because maybe it's running at an environment where you don't have security issues with leaking the stack trace, you can use include stack true. And also the other thing is that if that schema.defect has a cause field, now they are encoded as well by default using the same JSON defect encoding semantics used by schema.defect. So that means that now, if you have, for example, let's go back to this example. If you have, for example, your application error that has an error field or maybe a cause field that is a schema.defect, and then you have your error, which is again tagged error that has your cause, which is a schema.defect as well. If you end up in a situation where your error is something like new app error, cause my error, cause new error, by specifying that include cause we have seen before, by default, sorry, it will always include in the serialized data not just the error name and the error message for app error, but it will also serialize the cause and so the inner cause. So you will get basically over the wire the entire error stack. The error tree, not the error stack. And if you enable the error stack, you will get also the error stack as well. So I think that's really, really nice addition. And that, like, when you deal with things like effect RPCs or things like that, or HTTP APIs, it is really, really nice because you can gate, for example, that value of the Boolean to be something that comes from like a global environment, and decide that, for example, that when you're in dev, you propagate that stack as well, or when you are in production, you don't, or things like that. I think this makes errors stored in workflow more useful. Nice. Yeah, as well. Yeah, definitely. this is general when this is more useful in general when you store errors, because now the cause by default gets stored as well, um, which feels nicer and also like um, plays nicer when you want to reconstruct what happened and maybe you don't have full telemetry data yet. So that plays nicer. And also, if you even have telemetry data, that plays nicer as well, because I think that gets better serialized over the wire for telemetry data as well, if I recall correctly. Okay. Well, being able to serialize the error tree like that solves another issue for me too. Excited for that. Yeah, that's I think one really nice addition, because again, you don't have to then like provide your own way to do that. But then by default, let me check. There was an example in here, if I recall correctly. This is the constructor. And you can see in here that in the error that if I recall correctly, the error options, the error, blah, 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 this serialized codec JSON. If I recall correctly, there was the, there you go. This is the representation that the error gets over the wire, basically. It gets the message field, which is the string, optionally the name of the error. And then, as we mentioned before, you may have the stack string, and you may have the cause, which is again another JSON field. So whatever can be JSONified. I also wanted to go in encode JSON error. There you go. Yeah, you can see that. Yeah, by default, if the cause is unless the exclude cause is provided, by default we also encode the cause as a defect as well. So you get that three of things that are serialized over the wire or persisted if you are using that schema to persist some errors in some storage. And the nice thing is that when you deserialize back, it will attempt to reserialize that back by attempting to basically preserve the same structure. It will basically create a new error, and then it will attempt to reuse the same message. If it had the cause, it will refeed and redecode the entire cause. And if it had the name and the stack, it will feed back the error in the stack as well. So basically, it is a very good way to attempt to persist and store decoding errors, decoding defects, sorry. Okay, let me drink a little. Meanwhile, let me check if we have new questions. But hope that this little detour over the schema.defect got you something to think about in your applications. Okay. So I don't see any more questions incoming. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that if that's the case, we can wrap up. We have been running for 1 hour and 20 minutes. It's not 2 hours, so it cannot be called effect hours. It's effect hour. But yeah. Oh, there you have a question. Hi, Mattia. I want to understand how do I go about designing better layer abstraction or think better in terms of functional programming or effectful patterns? Any recommendation from you? Okay, so first of all, as always, it's not something you get from one day to another. It's something that you evolve over time. It's something you have to try um, very, very different patterns over time, and see the pros and cons of each pattern in order to get better at. But that said, which is obvious, I would say, um, my recommendations for designing better layers and abstraction. I think we could go maybe over a couple of errors, a couple of things I have seen people do, and I I would recommend. So let's write some. Let's write some pseudocode. So let's say that we have one service that is the user repo service, and this user repo service has a find by ID method that takes in a user ID and returns an effect option user, and maybe let's do like that interface. Okay, and that returns an effect and an option of a user, or SQL error, and then we have like save user maybe we're going to say username string, and that is an effect of void or SQL error, and this requires a SQL client. And finally, all. Okay, let's play a game. What do you all think? Let's play a game. So this is zoom in maybe. Okay. Let's say that this is the hypothetical shape for one user repository service. I'll give you a couple of minutes in chat to list a couple of improvements that can be done to this service by just looking at the shape of this service. And let's see in a couple of minutes what you all came up with. I know that there are many errors or maybe many things that I would design differently. So let's see what you think about this. I think that in here I see 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 improvements that can be done in here. At least 5 improvements. I'm feeling called out. I almost have any identical repository shape. Yes. Okay, a couple of seconds more for you all to send out your replies, and then we will start discussing them together. Okay. 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 Okay, so I see that overall you all pointed out a few good things. So let's go over them together. First one, from John says, should we be encoding requirements in the service interface? Sounds like a smell. So what John is saying that is in here we are encoding the SQL client as a dependencies of the single effects. And if you look at this service definition, this service define a user repository. And the user repository is not something that's strictly SQL based. I mean, it could be like maybe an Active Directory user repository, or it could be something like a file based one, or maybe it could interact with an external system that manages the actual users in the system. And so the first thing that I do is avoid leaking requirements. So that means that instead of having the SQL client requirement being here, that should be moved into the layer constructor. So instead of requiring the SQL client in here, we should have const SQL user repo layer, and this is a layer effect, for example, that will consume, gen, and these will consume our SQL client. So that way we get back something that's similar to a layer that outputs a user repo service, has no error, and requires an SQL client. Oh, obviously I meant to add that in here as well. So putting these same requirements on all of the methods, if the requirement describes something that how the service is actually implemented, that's a leakage, and that should not be done. So instead, those methods should not have leaking dependencies. So imp details go into layer construction. And this is the first one that you correctly guessed. So let's see what others said. I'm pretty sure I'm feeling option of user is missing a user, an error. Exactly. The other one is in here, option of user. I would say that the mostly effect semantic way of doing that probably is not doing an option of a user, because it's wrapping basically an option instead of an effect, but we should instead leverage the effect error channel. It could be instead something like an effect that returns directly a user and returns, for example, user not found error or an SQL error. And so to avoid options and leverage effect error channel. We could have a generic repository with the same reusable queries, and we would have passed only the user type. Well, I would not say that's an error. Repeating yourself is not bad. I mean, sometimes the cost of repetition is lower than the cost of wrong extraction. Specifically today with LLMs. So I would not consider that an error. I would consider that maybe more like a design choice. One could have a generic interface and then have user repo extend that interface. But yeah, I would not consider that strictly something that's not effect semantic way of doing things. And then we have user repo error instead of SQL error. Correct. The other thing that I see in here is that, again, in the same way we were leaking before the requirements that leaked basically to the outside world, which was the implementation of our user repository service, in here we are leaking an SQL error. And this is basically leaking. By just looking at this, I can say that the user repo is implemented by SQL and not by an Active Directory one, for example. So a more sound way is 3, do not leak imp via errors. So as you pointed out, maybe a user repo error makes more sense. And I would even say that the user repo error makes only sense if you think that there are ways to recover from a failure of this service. Because I could also see a situation where we consider, for example, the operation of saving something that either succeeds, and if it doesn't succeed, well, it should fail drastically. So I could even see something like save user to not have any typed error at all, because maybe it is doing in itself retries. And by seeing this, I understand that if what the expected behavior is that save user, if it encounters some error, I expect that to automatically retry that in itself. And eventually it could lead to a defect if the internal retry policy fails. But again, that's a domain choice. One depends on whatever, because it could be, for example, that the user repo error encodes both transient and non-transient error. Because if we have, for example, the user repo error baked by HTTP APIs on the provided by some other system, we could have the user repo error to map maybe transient HTTP retry after errors, and that's fine. Again, this tells the consumer that there are some errors that may be transient and that may be retried by the consumer. It's up to the consumer to then specify the retry policy for that method. SQL client should be passed as a dependency from repository. Yes, exactly. That's what we have done before. So you got it right. And then we have could have branded types for the user ID and username. Exactly. The username, yes, and the user ID, indeed, yes. Because again, you give an effect, and Schema has branded types. Probably in here, we would have used something like a user ID or username. And then in our system, we maybe have like type user ID being a string, a branded a string user ID, something like that. That is indeed one improvement we can make. Function is again leak requirement, exactly. So you all got that right. Then we have the requirement feels like as well, indeed. You just have to add make no mistakes to the prompt. Exactly. That was the fourth error. Yeah, exactly. And then we have leaking errors, replace SQL error, user repo errors is generic and catch all prompts. Exactly. More specific error, maybe. Exactly. And I am surprised that none of you actually catched the fact that list all have no parameters. So it does not make sense to have that being lazy. And it should have been just a property. Because again, effect is lazy by default. So there is no need to have a function that returns an effect, right? Effect is already lazy, so it can be used already like that. So I think that this gave you all a few rules. Maybe let's write it out for no lazy effects. I think that these are few rules of thumb that you can do on how you structure your services. Another thing that you can also do is that sometimes I see things like, for example, update. Let's say that we have update user email, and we have maybe user ID, and then email being email, returning an effect, void. One other thing that sometimes is worth considering is that you can also do something like this, where basically instead of providing some ID parameters, you can leverage the effect requirements to pass down maybe some context on what you are operating on. This is a stretch for a repository service because usually the repository services are something that interacts with an identity, and then they persist, they retrieve, or whatever. But if you have services that perform more business domain logic, such as the one that I am describing in here, that can be, for example, like my user management service. You can make it so that methods requires a current user. So that way, the way you pass in the parameters is by basically calling the update method with the current user on the context. And the interesting thing is that you can then maybe have a method in your APIs that basically just does something like with user and something that takes AR base effect of A, E, R, or and returns an effect of A, E, user not found, and then exclude from R the current user. And with user will be just something that basically does something like repo dot find by ID. Maybe we pass in the ID first. That will be what I wanted to do before. Okay, pass in the ID, and then we pipe that to flatmap user, and then we effect dot provide service to the base effect, the current user service, the user that we have fetched. So this is pseudocode. Basically, the idea is that you can, if you do APIs this way, then you can have helpers that basically take in a parameter, like the user ID in this case, and return a function that takes in any effect and basically erases the current user requirement from that effect, and it adds the user not found, and also obviously adds the user repo requirement. So that way, in your, for example, HTTP API, what you can do is to have handlers that do things like effect. Let's say that you have your handler that handles update email, and then that has payload, and that does an effect gen. Again, pseudocode. Sorry for that. And then you can do something like yield user management dot update user email of the payload dot id, and this would return an effect that, since we are yielding user management, has in the requirements the user management plus the current user as a service, but then we can pipe that to our with user payload.id. Sorry, update user payload.new mail. And sometimes these look nicer if you have a lot of methods that deals with some current resource. For example, the current tenant your application is running on, that can be maybe fetched by an HTTP API middleware, and so you don't need to do that, or things like that. And the current user in here could be even, or just the ID for the current user, or it could be maybe also like a prefetched version of all of the data if you don't expect that resource to change and be consumed immediately inside of the same effect. And this is another interesting pattern that sometimes I recommend. It plays nicely. It has obviously some drawbacks because, again, you have to eventually pipe and provide that requirements. So maybe it's not ideal if you just have like in here a single statement, but if you have maybe a more complex logic, like I said before, maybe you have multiple methods that operate on a single tenant. I could see that to be, for example, the current tenant, and the same can apply with tenant. And maybe your HTTP API resolve the tenant from the one either that comes from the HTTP API. But yeah, that is also another pattern that leverages the effect requirement channel in order to improve your services, because then if you have it's nice because you can imagine that if instead of this you had the other version that would have like something um, like this, you could see that when this version is basically polluting the error channel, and this polluting the error channel that means that basically you are not expressing the fact that you want that user ID to exist. And whereas with this signature, you are basically saying, hey, I need a current user in the requirement channel, and that requirement can only be satisfied if we have in the system an existing user. And so basically we are lifting the concern of providing a user that exists by picking that requirement and making that into the requirement instead of passing that as a user ID parameter. This is, again, both are valid patterns. Sometimes for some services these work better, and this is the other way to do that. There is no correct and incorrect one. This is just something that sometimes you can switch between one or the other. For example, as I said, current tenant in here, when you have like a multi-tenant application, works really nice, because then as I mentioned before, you can have like an HTTP API middleware, or you could have, for example, maybe something that initially you just decided to have like a concept of a current user, and then for entirety of your application, then you don't care about authentication, you just do that at the edges. You maybe don't even care about having a full user object, because then doing that at the edges if you want, for example, to provide a logic where when you have a behavior, for example, that if you are asking for a user that now does not exist, you create that at the moment immediately. If the API is shaped like this, you could not do that, because basically you are accessing the user and asserting that the user does not exist inside of the user management. Wherever with an API like that, you are basically lifting out that step of doing the check if the current user exists. And so it's up to the actual combinator with the user that's provided later on in the actual pipeline to decide what to do. You can again imagine, like, for example, that you can have a with user that maybe always provides the user, cannot fail. If the user does not exist, it can maybe sign up one on the fly, because maybe it have enough data. For example, update mail, we can imagine that we can sign up a user on the fly by using the new mail that's provided. But yeah, I hope that this gives you uh, quite a few things to think about. Okay, and that said, um, I think that we have finally reached a wrapping up point. I hope that I gave you a few things to think about. As always, I like when office hours are uh, um, are like that, because it's more brainstorming. It's not like this is the solution. I don't believe in that. I believe instead of discussing with you, seeing what works, what don't, pros and cons of each solution. um, this might be an interesting approach if your baking is user based and you have HTTP API. Yeah, exactly. If your baking is user based, tenant based, or things like that, and you have an HTTP API, then you have the HTTP API, as I mentioned, providing the headers, a cookie or something that provides the current user. That seems like a good pattern. Yeah. 30 degrees in my room is frying my brain. Yeah. So again, since my brain is starting to fry as well, I think that I'm gonna wrap up and thank you all for joining. And as always, let's see you all next week for next office hour, or next Wednesday effect day, as people love to call it. And yeah, it has been a pleasure. I hope that it has been inspiring. And again, thank you all for your time. See you next time. Bye bye.